Welcome to How to Rock the Stage Show, a show committed to equipping you to hone your media skills better to stand out from the crowd as a go-to expert in your field. Each week, Rich Bontrager interviews top leaders, influencers, authors, speakers, podcasters, and media professionals about how to leverage media best to help you shine brighter on camera and stage as a go-to expert. Now, here's your host, The Trigger, Rich Bontrager.
Welcome back to another edition of How to Rock the Stage Show. We're live streaming on multiple channels tonight, once again, helping you shine on camera and shine on stage by bringing amazing leaders, influencers, authors. And tonight, we're going live to Hollywood as we're going to talk a movie producer, writer, director. He has done it all. And you're going to have a great conversation here tonight. You don't want to miss it. But before we get into that, we do want to mention that, again, we are streaming on multiple channels. And in fact, tonight we are plugged in not just one, but two YouTube channels. So join us where you can, enter the conversation, ask questions. We would love to hear you through the chat box tonight. And of course, How to Rock the Stage Show is brought to you by Autovita Studios. Autovita Studios is powering Rock the Stage. They're going to take this very live TV show and they're going to turn it into an audio podcast for us, and they're going to amplify it through their amazing systems. If you want to know more about Autovita and how they can help you with your podcasting, audio, or audiobooks, contact them at autovitastudios.com. So we are here tonight to get into the writing, to the story, to the narrative, to the creative side tonight. And we are blessed to have Marc Scott Zicree with us. He has written and produced hundreds of hours of TV programs, worked on virtually all the major TV networks and studios. His credits include Star Trek: The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Twilight Zone, the TV series, Babylon 5, Beauty and the Beast, Forever Night, which I actually love Forever Night, Sliders, Friday the 13th, the series, Liberty Kids, Superfriends, He-Man, Real Ghostbusters, Smooth, the Smurfs. And again, he has written multiple pilots, but he's probably best known for writing the #1 all-time fan favorite episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Marc, welcome to How to Rock the Stage tonight.
Really glad to be here. Good to see you, Rich.
Great to have you with us. And again, as we've been talking backstage in a little bit, science fiction is amazing. It's rich. And you've had the ability to put your voice and your brand into that. What does that personally mean to you to be one of the guys that gets to be in the writer's room?
Well, it's really terrific. I had a sense of calling very young. And it's very funny. I recently went to my 50th high school reunion, and then next day it was my elementary school reunion, and I knew all the kids from my elementary school. I recognized all of them. Many I hadn't seen for 50 years or more, and one of them reminded me that when I was a kid, when I was like 8, my stepfather built me my very own spaceship, and I would give tours of the solar system to the kids in the neighborhood. So 2 of the kids from my elementary school came to my studio, my Space Command studio, and saw the giant alien spaceship set that we've got among the other sets of spaceships. And they said, "You are the same person. You have not changed one bit. You have followed your vision. You have not swerved an inch." And that was very gratifying. So looking back from this part of my life, to say I succeeded at what I set out to do, and am still doing it, still creating work that's meaningful to me and hopefully my audience. And so it's all very gratifying.
Well, and again, you're known as Mr. Sci-Fi.
Yes.
The book collection behind you,
yeah,
is probably a little bit bigger than mine, and I've done pretty well. By the way, people are already sending you love and appreciation to the chat, so people are pumped to have you here with us tonight.
Thank you.
What was your inspiration to get into this? Was it a certain author? Was it a certain story? What?
Yeah. Well, I was reading science fiction from as soon as I could read. I mean, I remember my favorite book when I was 7 years old was Farmer in the Sky by Robert A. Heinlein, which I have somewhere over there. And and I loved science fiction in books, short stories, TV, film. It was just where my head lived. And when I was 10, the original Star Trek debuted. And I recorded it on reel-to-reel tape in case it never aired again, because we didn't have VCRs back then. And my mom was a divorced mom raising me, and one of her boyfriends who'd been in showbiz, seeing that I was a huge Star Trek fan, took me to meet Nichelle Nichols, who was a friend of his. And she, of course, was playing Uhura at the time. And I went to her apartment. She signed a photo of herself as Uhura to me. She gave me 6 of her scripts from Star Trek, her personal copies, which I still have.
They were
And
going in the trash can, right?
that's
They
what
were heading for the
she gave
trash
me. Well, she gave me one that was signed to me, and then I said, "Do you have any more of these?" Because I was a smart kid. And she reached in the wastebasket and pulled out 5 more scripts, which wonderful, wonderful. And those are the first scripts I ever read. That's how one of the ways I learned how to write scripts. And not long after, I actually got a tour of the Star Trek set for the last episode of Star Trek they ever shot, Turnabout Intruder. And then full circle, I recently, before her passing, I was able to shoot a scene with Nichelle Nichols for Space Command. So that was just really a dream come true.
Again, wow from Jan, who's streaming along with us here tonight, and that is a big wow.
Thanks.
We are going to get into Space Command,
Mm.
and it is an exciting new project you've got going. And when you think of Star Trek, the names, the list, the credits, Gene Roddenberry, the Bird of the Galaxy, it did inspire a lot of people. It
Yes.
really
Yes.
sparked a whole new generation of writers and creators because he had pitched it as the wagon train to the stars.
Yeah,
It was
exactly.
a Western in space, but did that grab you that way, or how did
Yeah,
it grab you?
no, that's what he said to the executives to try to get them to understand it, who were not science fiction fans. Rod Serling had the same challenge when he was trying to sell Twilight Zone. It took him. He wrote 4 pilots for Twilight Zone before one sold, and got on the air. So they were always having to get past these executives who were not imaginative, let us say. But the fascinating thing, the thing that Roddenberry did right and Serling did right. The 3 shows that made me want to be a writer were the original Twilight Zone, the original Outer Limits, and the original Star Trek. And interestingly enough, with the passing of David McCallum, on Mr. Sci-Fi, I just did a remembrance of him, noting the 2 great Outer Limits episodes he did, The Sixth Finger and The Form of Things Unknown. So, but what all 3 of those showrunners did was they hired science fiction novelists who also knew how to write TV scripts. So they weren't just saying, okay, well, let's go to the guys who write Gunsmoke, or let's go to the guys who write Perry Mason. That's the mistake they make on TV now. When you see these science fiction shows and they're crap, it's because they're just looking at who the current stable of TV writers is, whether or not they have the imagination, whether or not they understand science fiction. So, but what Roddenberry did, and Serling, and Leslie Stevens and Joe Stefano on Outer Limits, is they reached out to the science fiction novelist community, the people who actually had ideas that were outside the box, the people who could actually crack open your head and fill it with ideas. And so they had, Richard Matheson, Charles Beaumont, Ray Bradbury, Harlan Ellison, on and on, and just, the Theodore Sturgeon, the great writers of science fiction. And I noticed even as a kid that the writers who were writing for these terrific shows that I loved were also writing the books and novels, the novels and the short stories that I loved as well. Same writers, and so as soon as I was a teenager, I started going to science fiction conventions and meeting those writers, and many of them became friends and mentors, and that was invaluable. But I realized that, like, when Star Trek debuted, every single week it would just knock you back. It wasn't like anything that had been on television before. It was so great, and and to go on that set and sit in the captain's chair, and stand on the transporter and see the little screw-in light bulb up top, and for a 10-year-old kid, I mean, my God, that was just like going into the land of Oz. It was phenomenal.
Oh, that is beautiful. So many different directions already that we could go this, but I want to go back to Saturday morning cartoons. I grew
Sure.
up on Saturday morning. I grew up on Scooby Doo, Land of the
Mm.
Lost.
Huh.
I grew up watching
Yeah.
Super Friends. Okay,
Wow. How fun.
and Casey Kasem was doing the voices, multiple voices, and everything else. But you started your career in Saturday morning cartoons as a writer. That was
Yeah.
your first opening, if I'm correct.
Well, yeah. I mean, basically, growing up, I know I would either be a writer or a visual artist. I had skills in both areas. So I went to UCLA as a painting, sculpture, and graphic arts major, got my degree in that, had gallery shows when I was a teenager, all that stuff. But when I was 19, I went to the Clarion Writers Workshop at Michigan State University. It was a 6-week workshop where each week a different famous science fiction writer would come and live in the dorms with 25 students in the workshop, and you'd write like crazy. And at that workshop, our teachers were Joe Haldeman, Samuel R. Delaney, Gene Wolfe, Damon Knight, Kate Wilhelm, and one Roger Zelazny. And so an amazing lineup. These were the greats. And Damon Knight was editing an anthology, and I gave him a story I'd written actually back at UCLA in my first English class, story in which Disney takes over the world. They basically thaw out Walt. There was all those rumors that he was cryogenically frozen. They thaw him out, and they show him Disney World, which is literally the entire world. And it was called Leader of the Club. and Damon bought that, and that was my first sale when I was 19. And so that convinced me that I wanted to be a professional writer, and I was already leaning that way. So as soon as I got out of college, there were no classes in how to write for television, so I started writing the Twilight Zone companion because I'd met George Clayton Johnson, one of the great writers of this Twilight Zone and Star Trek, and I just started interviewing people and ultimately convinced Rod's widow, Carol, to let me write the book. This is only 2 years after Rod died, so I was crawling through his attic and going through his files and all that stuff. It was amazing, but at the same time, I knew I wanted to write for TV. TV has always been my art form. I'm from the first generation of TV kids. I remember sitting on my little wicker and wood chair in my Mickey Mouse hat watching Mickey Mouse Club when I was like 4 or whatever. And so I remember Dragnet and
Oh,
Highway Patrol
yeah.
and the Adventures of Superman with George Reeves and all that stuff. And so when I got back from Clarion to finish my 2 years at UCLA as an art major, in adult education, they were the famous Theodore Sturgeon, one of the great science fiction writers, great writer for Star Trek. Theodore Sturgeon was teaching an adult education writing class. Now, as an undergrad, I was forbidden from taking those classes, but I thought, well, hell with that. It's Theodore Sturgeon. I'm not going to miss this. So I took the class, and Ted became a very great friend and mentor. My photo of Ted appears on 2 of his books as his author's photo, interestingly enough. And he was a wonderful man, amazing, brilliant man. And but his teaching assistant was another kid from Clarion who had gone to Clarion 3 years before I had, and his name was Michael Reeves. And Michael was this acerbic, funny, wonderful person, and we became friends. And Michael, as well as writing novels and short stories that he was selling by that point, Michael was 5 years older than me. He was also writing animation. Now, I'm not one of those kids who'd grown up wanting to write animation. I liked Rocky and Bullwinkle. I liked all these shows, or Bugs Bunny. I loved Bugs Bunny, but I never thought, well, gee, I'd love to write for them.
Right.
But Michael was writing for animation, and at one point he said, "Would you like to co-write an episode of Space Ghost with me?" It was for a show called Space Stars, and it was Space Stars finale. So I said, sure. So we wrote one together, and then Smurfs was just starting up. And so we wrote Smurfs together, and then it was very clear I could write these on my own. And so then I was off and running. And for the first few years of my career, I was writing for Smurfs and He-Man and Superfriends and Real Ghostbusters and on and on and on, hundreds of shows. And sometimes I'd even be writing, half of an entire show myself. Michael and I there was a show called Pole Position, an animated show, and Michael and I wrote all the episodes, I think. I think we also did that on Black Star, which was a precursor to He-Man.
Yes.
And it was great fun, and I brought my A game, and because the TV shows, the animated shows of that era fell into basically 2 camps: superhero, and He-Man sort of fits into that sort of superhero science fiction fantasy kind of thing, or funny animal, and Smurfs fit into that, and the Biscuits and the Littles, all these shows I wrote for, and so I was learning my craft and being paid for it. I was earning 6 figures a year writing animation, which is pretty amazing back then, and because I was a kid in my early 20s, and then I just at the same time I was writing the Twilight Zone companion because I was going between those 2 projects, and then the Twilight Zone companion sold and was a big hit. After 2 years of rejection, it was rejected by 25 publishers, and then I wrote a spec movie as a live action movie script,
Yep.
and that sold. And that got me into live action writing for Star Trek. And I also developed Captain Power and Soldiers of the Future. So that was another live action way in.
So that's a great place to make the transition here of,
Yeah,
and we do have writers with us tonight. Jan's a writer, and she's got
great.
a children's book and things like that. So
Cool.
again, if you have questions, drop in the chat. We'll happily moderate those, bring those in. But
Do that.
is there a difference between the animation and writing? Because it's usually 12, 15 minutes max
Yeah.
versus the live action TV. How big of a jump should writers know about?
It's somewhat different. I'm the only writer who wrote for both Smurfs and Friday the 13th, the series. And both series, the main characters said the same phrase over and over and over, which was, "Oh no."
But for 2 different reasons.
Calamity was always befalling them. And but the real thing was, yes. First of all, the cartoons that I was writing for, some of them were half hour, one story and a half hour, like Black Star or He-Man. So
Yeah.
it was very similar to the structure of Twilight Zone or any of those, because Twilight Zone was the great half hour show, and so they were similar. You had to learn the character voice. You had to understand in your head. You had to hear the character in your head, and so a lot of the skills in terms of structure, in terms of pacing, in terms of coming up with a story, in animation, it segued over to live action. The big difference is there were two big differences. One was you could go deeper with a live action story. You could go deeper into character, like Far Beyond the Stars, for instance. You could really profoundly explore a very human thesis, a very human theme that would be because I knew from Star Trek and Twilight Zone and Outer Limits that one episode of one TV show could change someone's life forever. It could
Well,
transform you.
right. Yes. And it's happened time and
Yes.
time again.
Yes. And so I took that very seriously. Even when I was writing animation, I was never writing down. Someone once said, "Do you write for the children in the audience?" I said, "No, I write for the child in myself." So and
Well,
and
I mean,
yeah,
like, if you go back to some of those Saturday morning cartoons as an
yes,
adult, you pick
yes,
on the subtext.
yes,
There's
yes,
more going on with Scooby Doo. There's more going on with Super Friends
yeah,
than people would ever imagine if you go back and watch
yes.
it from a different lens.
Well, we loved it. All of us writing for animation at that stage, it was a very small group of people. We all knew each other, and we were all represented by one agent, Candy Montero, and we were writing for all the companies. So in a given week, I would probably be writing one script for, Hanna-Barbera and outlining something for Deke or for Filmation or for Ruby Spears or for Marvel. And I was always working on multiple projects simultaneously, which was very good training for my live action work and even the work I'm doing now with Space Command.
Yeah.
But so you learn to write very quickly. You learn to write on deadline. You learn to write on up to a page count. So, for instance, if someone said it needs to be 52 pages, I could land exactly on 52 pages. We had to call all of the shots in animation. So the scripts were like 50 pages for a half-hour show, but it was very, very helpful. So there were more similarities than differences between writing animation and writing live action. The one other big difference was in live action they have to make it, they have to build it. It's a physical thing.
Right.
So in animation, there were budgetary limitations in terms of what they could draw, how much they could animate. But in live action, it's always, can we build this? Can we do this? I remember on one show I was a story editor on. Um, uh, my friend Michael Reeves pitched a story to us where that took place on a cargo plane in flight. And so we called up our line producer in Canada. Our writing offices were here in LA, and we said, "Can we do an episode set on a cargo plane?" And he said, if you do another episode set on a submarine, because we could then redress it to a submarine and amortize
Yes.
the cost over the two
Yes.
episodes.
Yes.
So
Yes.
we said, done.
So as a writer, you've got a lot of creative license. I'm going to take you to,
Yes.
I know the Star Trek storyline, the history of the writer's
Yeah.
room.
Yeah.
Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, you wrote for both.
Mm-hmm.
The writer's room is very controlled, though.
Yes.
The writer's room is very controlled, and the way the actors had to deliver the line that you wrote. Was there frustration in writing like that? Or did
No.
you like the fact that you knew your words were going to be on that screen?
Well, I wasn't on staff on Star Trek. I was always a freelancer on Star Trek because I was on other shows. So, for instance, when my Deep Space Nine episode was shot, I was a producer on Sliders. I had an office at Universal. So I was right. So, in fact, two of my scripts were being shot by two different studios the same day. I got photos of myself in the same clothes with the cast of Deep Space Nine on Far Beyond the Stars and the cast of Sliders on Slide Cage. And then when I was story editing Friday the 13th, the series, we were on the Paramount lot. It was actually a Paramount production. And so I saw all of the cast of Star Trek: The Next Generation before the audience ever met them. They would eat en masse in makeup, full makeup and costume, at the executive dining room where I ate my lunches, and there they were. And so I met all of those writers from the get-go. So I knew Ron Moore and Brandon Braga and Ira Bear and Ricky Manning and Hans Beimler and so forth. And Michael Piller, who was the showrunner, a great showrunner on Next Gen. It was after I'd sold to my episode First Contact to him that we discovered that we were second cousins, which we didn't know at the time. My grandmother's name was Agnes Piller. So later we had lunch together and we talked. But when I was 13 years old, we were both at my Uncle Adolph's funeral and didn't know each other. So
Again, they say the Star Trek family is a real family, and I've heard it, I've seen it.
yeah,
I do want to ask you about your Deep Space Nine episode. Deep
sure.
Space Nine was not received initially well. It
Yeah.
was very serialized. It was, for a while, an unclear narrative, and it became a
Yes.
war narrative. It became coming out of concentration camps. A very deep story. I love it
Yes.
now. But
Yeah.
your episode took them out of costume, took them
Yes.
into a narrative of racial tension
Yes.
and the dreamy aspect of a writer's world. You really
Yes.
brought you into the episode without being on the episode. Was that
Yes.
part of your intention?
Yes. Very much so. When I saw the original run of Star Trek when I was 10, uh, and beyond, I saw that you could write stuff that was deeply, profoundly truthful, commenting on the real world that had never been written before. Harlan Ellison, who wrote City on the Edge of Forever, which is one of the great episodes of Star Trek,
Yes.
told me a very interesting story. And there was another writer who had pitched to Star Trek, and he said, I pitched them Flight of the Phoenix, and they didn't catch on that I was, borrowing from that movie. It was an episode called Galileo 7. Not a bad episode, but
No.
Harlan said to the writer, "You in taking that and just running it by them, you cheated not only them but yourself because you could have written something that no one had ever seen before that was from your heart, and you squandered that opportunity." And I really remember that and took that to heart. And so whenever I pitched to Star Trek or whenever I come up with anything, but particularly Star Trek was a great opportunity to come up with something totally fresh, totally out of the box, totally new and fresh. And so when I pitched First Contact to Star Trek: The Next Generation, the idea was, uh, the prime directive. We've seen it. Cultures that you can't reach out to, you can't communicate with, they're below a certain level of technology. And then with the Klingons, the Romulans, and so forth, you can because the prime directive is off because they're at your level of technology. But I said, what happens when a culture reaches the point where the prime directive cuts out, stops,
Yeah.
and the Enterprise is sent to make first contact? And the idea was that it's like our guys are the aliens coming out of the UFO. Really, it's like a totally. And so that everyone's eyes lit up when I pitched that. And
Well, it was a great episode. And again,
mhm.
there is the Generations movie, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the
Yes,
episode of Star
the
Trek.
episode.
Just so people are
Yes,
clear on that.
yeah, and yeah,
I do have a question coming in. This is from
sure,
William Hodell. He's out in
yeah.
Hollywood. He's involved in the industry.
Hmm.
He was on the show. William wants to know, was there a plot structure that carried over most of your script? If so, what was it?
Okay,
Did you have a pattern?
yeah, but let me I'll answer the DS9 question first, then let's come back to that in a
Yeah.
moment. That with DS9, it was an even greater opportunity. And what I wanted to explore, which had never been explored in television, was the world of 1950s science fiction writers.
Yes.
Because Ted, as I said, Ted Sturgeon was one of my mentors, and I was amazed at these guys who wrote these galaxy-spanning stories who were gods to us, our science fiction fans, but who then, like Ted was living in Silver Lake, he was living in a converted laundry room. It wasn't even an apartment, and it had a door this high, and I banged my head on the lintel. It was like a Morlock would live there. And I realized he was living this impoverished life, and yet he was this astonishing writer. And it was the guys who wrote for a penny a word, for 5 cents a word, who, for the love of it, Harlan Ellison, Isaac Asimov, Ted Sturgeon, Ray Bradbury, all these amazing writers. You wouldn't have Star Trek, you wouldn't have Star Wars if not for those guys who wrote for the love of it. And I wanted to show why science fiction was important, why it wasn't just meaningless crap, and why it had meaning, why it was important. And it was important because you could create a future, and by creating it, people could aspire to it. You could create the future by showing that future.
Well,
And yeah,
and again, you took them out of makeup,
yes,
costume. You shattered the character mold.
yes,
And
yes,
listening to the actors talk about this at many conventions I've gone to as well, they always bring up your episode. They
yes,
always talk about
yes.
this
And
was so different and so
that's
unique,
right.
and they thank you over and over again.
Well, it's funny because when I saw the pilot of Deep Space Nine, I thought Armin Shimmerman was terrific as Quark, and there was a director who was attached to one of my pilots who was also a director on DS9, and I said, I want to meet that actor. So he took me on the set of DS9, and there was Quark in all of his glory, and I met Armin, and we became very good friends. We just had lunch a few weeks ago, in fact, and I said to him when I was coming up with this storyline, I said, I'm going to do an episode where we get to see your face. And ironically, that's what I did with Doug Jones too, interesting on Space Command. But I thought it'd be so cool to see, Rene Aubergenois and all of these wonderful actors, and then the idea of taking them back to the 50s. And again, it was the whole idea was they are not versions of those characters back in the 50s. They are versions of the science fiction writers, with the idea that Benny is drawing inspiration for the characters he's creating from the people he knows, which we all do as writers. And so then we were off and running. We all knew when we were just sitting around the table before it was even written that it was going to be one of the great Star Trek episodes of all time. We just knew, and it certainly was. I'm very proud.
And again, there's, I mean, we could dissect that episode. I know people have done that, but again, thank you for that. As a fan, as a creator myself,
Yeah,
I love seeing that you completely turn the tables, change it all, and it's just wonderful.
Yeah, it was
now,
amazing.
Let's go back to William's question here for a second, because again, thank you, William. It's great to have you back here tonight. But I do want to drop this back in about: is there a structure that helps you do what you do? Is there a pattern, but not a pattern? How are you doing this?
Yes. In my early years as a writer, I struggled a lot with structure. It was very difficult for me. And then I think it was the year that I was writing, or the summer that I was writing all the episodes of Pole Position. I was writing so quickly and so much that all of a sudden it clicked in. It just became second nature, and it was just like the bones of a house, And so it's sort of like, but at base, structure is simply you start with someone who has a problem, you escalate the problem, you get them in the worst shit possible, and then if it's a happy ending, they get themselves out of it. If it's a tragic ending, they fail to. That's basically structure. That's what structure is.
Yeah.
And and the more you deviate from that kind of structure, the better the writing has to be. That's why when Tarantino was shaking up all the timetables in Pulp Fiction and all that, it has to be really good writing, because it's standing on the dialogue and on the characters, because you don't know where the story's going. But certainly, now the great part is that because of streaming and because of binging on DVD and Blu-ray and so forth, now you can tell a story over an entire season, or even multiple seasons. That's what Joe Straczynski was doing on Babylon 5, which was and he was inspired by Hill Street Blues, So it's like, but that back then it was frowned upon. You weren't supposed to do that, because when syndication, it would be all out of order, and it'd be incomprehensible. So Spock and Kirk and McCoy are the same in the first episode essentially as they are in the last episode, because and so like one week he throws Edith Keeler under the truck, and Kirk is shattered, and the next week he's on to the next girl, so and yeah.
So we do have questions coming in. Ed Bontrager, my brother's watching tonight. He says hello from Kentucky. He wants to know, have you ever considered presenting at the annual Library of Congress at the book festival? He said you would probably be great for the children.
Sure. If someone knows anybody there and wants to recommend me, I'm game. You bet. Absolutely.
You mentioned Doug Jones, and I do want to mention another great project that you are heavily involved with. In fact, you and your wife are working on this project. Yes. Let's talk about Space Command. I've been watching it. Let me just make sure everyone understands what I'm talking about here, because Space Command, he's working on a new show. It's up on the web. We're going to share a YouTube channel. But Doug Jones, I've been watching. In fact, I just wrapped up the final episodes of Falling Skies again. Doug Jones was always in makeup. Most of the shows he's been in makeup. You take him out of makeup for this. Thank you very much. Armin Shimmerman is in this new Space Command. Mira Furlan is in this. She's from Babylon 5. Billy Mummy from Lost Space, Babylon 5. Robert Picardo, Ethan Phillips are all in this. And
Neil deGrasse Tyson's in it.
Wow. So besides that's not on my cheat sheet. But what I find interesting, and one you touched on this as a writer, it's an action adventure science fiction.
Yes.
But like some of the best science fiction ever, you know how to bring humor in and use it well. Many writers, it breaks the continuity, it breaks the characters, but you weave it in extremely well. How do you do that?
Well, part of it is, first of all, I have a natural sense of humor, I think. I think that helps. But also, when I was writing animation, basically it was simply a mixture of adventure and comedy. With Smurfs, you've got to be able to write the comedy, or a lot of those shows, there's humor in them. And it just kind of fell naturally to me. But the trick is, and this is very important, when you have characters who are in a pressure situation and they're joking, they're never laughing at the threat. The threat is taken seriously so you don't get taken out of the story, and they're joking as a way of dealing with the pressure. It's a verbal mechanism.
Yes.
It's pressure as a release of, because they're frightened, and or and so you use humor sparingly, but it's fun. It's super fun, and it's great when you're in an audience. We had a premiere of the first 2 hours of Space Command at the Chinese Theater in Hollywood, and to hear the audience laughing at some of these jokes. There's a great joke about Detroit that always pays off, and really fun. And so yeah, so I just write with my own sense of humor. I'm still writing to entertain myself, essentially, and so it's just and you want all of these elements to come together: the drama, the heart, the humor, all of it. Yes.
We're getting several requests about Babylon 5.
Yes.
Well, what's a great writer's story about Babylon 5?
Sure. Well, it's interesting, the genesis of Babylon 5, because you asked me earlier about my career and the early days, and everything leads to everything else in a strange way. And so when I was starting out, there was a young man who was writing newspaper articles, and he wanted to get into TV. And so Michael Reeves and I recommended him to our friends at Filmation, and he got hired there. I think he also was independently of us reaching out to Filmation as well. But we were all in that same circle. We would go to each other's parties. We knew each other. We'd have lunch with each other. It was very collegial. When they talk about people being dog eat dog in Hollywood, that was not true of animation writers at all. We were all young friends. We were supportive of each other. And so he started in animation. He rose quickly, as did I, as did Michael, and then he was story editing Real Ghostbusters, which I wrote for, which was super fun to write for. And then I was hired, once I'd gotten into live action, I was hired to develop a show called Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future. And it was a live action science fiction show. And even though it was paid for by Mattel, and it was built to launch a series of toys, I wanted to treat it exactly like a live action adult science fiction show. So I spent a year developing it with backstories for the characters and all of these really interesting metaphors and all sorts of stuff. I mean, I brought all of it into that. So they wanted me to story edit it because they had a full season guarantee. I mean, it was everything I write gets made, and I couldn't do it because I was writing features at the time. I wasn't available, but they were going to hire someone who was a Hollywood hack and would have ruined it. And I thought, and my wife said, "You've got to tell them." And I said, "Well, but I can't. I have to plug someone else in. Can't just leave them hanging." So I said to them, "Look, there's a friend of mine. He's never done live action television, but I'll guarantee him. And if he can't do the job, I'll step in." And that was Joe Straczynski, and J. Michael Straczynski. And the two producers on Captain Power were Doug Netter and John Copeland, who he did Babylon 5 with. So the first mention of Babylon 5, interestingly enough, is in Captain Power, because Joe story edited that first season. So then it took 5 years for them to sell Babylon 5. And finally, Ron Thornton did the little bit of CG animation that helped sell it. Ron actually worked on Space Command with me, as well as Star Trek and many other projects. He's no longer with us. So Babylon 5 started up, and I reached out to Joe and said I'd be interested in writing this. I actually read the Babylon 5 script, the pilot script, 5 years before it ever sold. In fact, I've got that somewhere in my files. It was terrific. I read it and I thought, this is a great show, and I was very glad it sold. And so then Joe invited me, to write for it, and he gave me the basic notion of Garibaldi falling off the wagon. And so I wrote an episode called Survivors. And interestingly enough, I named two characters with the last name Kemmer as my tip of the hat to Space Patrol, the great 1950s TV show starring Ed Kemmer. And then the Kemmers are now in Space Command. So it all kind of cross-pollinates. And so the fun part was when I was writing that episode of Babylon 5, because Warner's shot the 2-hour pilot and then waited a year before greenlighting the series. They wanted to air it and see what kind of response it got.
Yes.
They tore down all the sets. So
Right.
when they gave it a season order, they had to rebuild everything from scratch. So when I was writing the script, I had to see if what I was writing matched the physicality of the sets. So I went on to the set as they were building it, and the Zocalo, and I just rolled out the blueprints with John Accavelli, the production designer, and said, okay, here's what I'm envisioning. Does this work? And then when they were shooting, I went on set and I took a photo of myself with the cast of Babylon 5, which is quite wonderful. And a little while later, I took Andreas Katselas to lunch when I was a producer at Universal, and he told me I was the only producer who had ever taken him to lunch. And it was such a shame. He was such a brilliant actor. He was
Wow.
so great. Writing Jakar and Londo, those were my favorite scenes because they were such vibrant characters, and I really enjoyed it. And I thought the design of
Oh my gosh, that was crazy.
brilliant.
That was
Yeah,
completely different.
for years I had that face on my wall. The makeup guy gave me the full face prosthetic that Andreas wore, and now I think it's in the Television Museum in New York, something like that. There was a group of fans who donated it there.
I've still got more to get through, and I know the clock is ticking on this, but I do want to get in.
Sure.
You wrote the landmark book, The Twilight Zone Companion,
Yes.
but it's more than just Twilight Zone. Can you explain this book for people that have never heard it? But this is
Yes.
award-winning, amazing book.
Yes, and I just did the updated edition. I added another
Oh, you
100
did?
pages to it, 500 new photos, links to audio and video. So the third edition, if you want a total experience, that's the one to go for. I felt by studying one of the great shows, I'd learned how to make great television. And fortunately, other than Rod Serling, having passed away 2 years before I started working on the book, everyone else was around. I mean, Charles Beaumont had died of a terrible disease, but everyone else was around, the directors, the writers, the actors. And so I was able to just interview everybody and go through Rod Serling's attic and his files and his scrapbooks. And I found video of him teaching a class that was never intended to be aired. So he was absolutely honest. He told the real stories. And it was just phenomenal. So it took me 5 years from when I started the book to when it came out in 1982. It's been in print ever since. And it was just a remarkable experience. And many of the people I interviewed became very, very good friends. Doug Hayes, who was the director of Eye of the Beholder, many other great episodes, and the writers and so forth. I mean, and Bill Mumy, of course. I'd known Bill Mumy since I was 7. That's another story. But now he's in Space Command, and
I
so
was in Space Command. Yeah,
yeah. And you were asking about Space Command. I wanted to mention what that is and how it came about.
please.
After all these decades of writing, I'm closing in on my 50th year as a professional writer. Um, I When I did the Star Trek episode with George Takei through Star Trek New Voyages, it was a fan production, but I brought my entire A game to it as a writer, director, producer, and I realized that you could make a show that could go toe to toe with the networks on the internet.
Yeah.
The technology with digital cameras, with the internet, with YouTube, with all these with crowdfunding, you no longer needed to just jump through the hoops of the networks or the studios. And it's because when I started, you needed a network and a studio to reach millions of people. Now, all you need is what we're doing here.
It's right here.
Yeah. So I reached out to my audience. I'd never raised money before because I wanted to do, at that time, science fiction was very dark, very dystopic a few years ago. Or it was just incompetently made, where you go, oh, Jesus, that's
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
So I thought I wanted to do something inspiring and space going that would inspire people the way Star Trek inspired me, something that would say that we can create a future worth living in. We've got to not give in to fear, not give in to polarization, reach across boundaries and barriers, come from compassion, come from a good heart, and that it would work, and it does work. And Roddenberry had that same message, and Serling had that same message. Neither of those guys were cynics or pessimists. They weren't. So I reached out to my audience, and to date, my audience has given me over $4 million, and with it, I've built my own studio, which is 3 shooting stages. It's just south of Los Angeles. It's got spaceship sets and giant robots and 8-foot-tall aliens and spacesuits and you name it. And we just finished the rough cut of hours 5 and 6 of Space Command. It's a 12-hour season. We've written the rest of the scripts, so we're just moving forward. And then we have 5 series that we're doing after that that I'm co-creating with the creators of Farscape and The Expanse and many other shows. So there's a lot still to come. So I think I've got my calendar pretty well filled through 2035. So
For those who have not caught it, in the chat is a link to
yes,
2-hour pilot of Space Command.
yeah,
You need to go watch it. You need to earmark it. And Mr. Sci-Fi,
Yes.
of course, we're going to share his channel in just a few minutes.
Yeah.
I also do want to bring your wife. Elaine is your co-creator. She's
Yes.
working on Space Command with you. I know you have tons to say about her.
Yes.
But I also found this. You guys are considered super mentors. You guys
Yes.
love to give back.
Yes.
I'm a huge mentorship fan.
Yes.
In the industry, I believe it's the best way to learn in the industry.
Yeah.
So applause to you both, but can you share your passion for that?
Yes, yes, yes. One of the things I love about science fiction is that the fans become the professionals. And that goes all the way back to Ray Bradbury and Ted Sturgeon, Isaac Asimov. They all started as fans. And so in science fiction, there isn't that divide. If you go to a science fiction convention, your favorite writers are going to be there, whether it's Brandon Sanderson or Joe Haldeman or Robert Silverberg, whoever, they're there. George R. R. Martin goes to the World Science Fiction Convention, for God's sake. I mean, it's a family. And
Yes.
mentorship. Ray Bradbury mentored Charles Beaumont and Richard Matheson and George Clayton Johnson, the great writers of Twilight Zone. You know, I saw that there was that tradition of mentorship, and those writers, you know, Ted Sturgeon and Matheson and Harlan and all these guys became mentors to me, and so I wanted to pay it forward very much, and so. I met Elaine back when I was in college. We were married immediately after college. I got married at 21, and we very much share the vision that compassion is vital in our lives, and but it's active compassion. It's not just, oh, that poor man over there, you know, what a shame. No, it's action, action. And so 30 years ago, we started something called The Table, and it's just to create a compassionate community in the entertainment industry. It's open to writers, directors, actors, producers, anyone in film, TV, or books. It started, and it meets every Thursday via in person and via Zoom. And once you come to one meeting in person or via Zoom, then you can be on the email and all of that stuff. You can come to regular meetings or not. There's no fees, no dues. It's entirely community. And we have thousands of members around the world now. We've run it every Thursday for 30 years, and everyone's welcome. You have every race, every religion, nationalities from around the world. You know, it's amazing, and people are welcome. You know, if they're starting out or if they're Oscar winners, we have both. You know, and so there's no judgment of who's deserving, who has talent, none of that. Because Hollywood is so needlessly arrogant and so needlessly cruel, and it excludes people for such stupid reasons.
Yes.
And so I wanted to create Hollywood the way I wanted Hollywood to be, because there's no use in just complaining about something and not doing anything about it.
Yes.
Because if I can't necessarily change that Hollywood. It's awful, and it exists.
Yes.
But there's also good Hollywood of good people who have good hearts, and I know them, and that Hollywood is as real as the ugly one. I mean, Guillermo del Toro is a great guy. I wrote a book with him, and Gene Roddenberry and Rod Serling and all these wonderful people. I mean, they come from their hearts. They go home to their families. They're not slime balls, you know. And I always say to when young people come to the table, I say to them, it's up to you to decide which Hollywood you want to be a part of, the creepy Hollywood or the good Hollywood. I said, from the beginning, you have the power to say no. And if something feels wrong, if something creeps you out, it's not your only chance. You'll get many, you know, and that I think helps people. I think it really makes the world better.
Since you're talking about writing, I should mention that we got 2 rapid fire questions that we're going to take. They're good questions. But you also are a novelist. You talk about writing the Magic Time trilogy, HarperCollins and Blackstone Audio. So congratulations on that. If you want to go Google that, everybody. But coming in, Edward wants to know, how do you find that group? Is there a URL? Is there
The Table?
Yeah.
If you email me, marczicree@gmail.com, I'll send you the link. And so that's that. It's that simple. Because we're deliberately not public in the way of where because it's not an organization. I'm not out to earn money or anything from it. Yep. I mean, for a few years, Elaine and I taught classes where we would mentor people 10 at a time for like $699 for 6 weeks. But ultimately, with the studio and Space Command, it just became impossible, you know. So, but the one thing I never gave up, through thick and thin, I mean, even when I was a producer on Sliders at Universal, every Thursday I was running The Table because you know, that's how you make something grow. You put in the time, you know, and I could do that. So I'd come from the soundstage, you know, that was fine, you know.
Marc, you have such a wealth of information. There's so much more. You recently also did an episode of The World Enough and Time.
Yes.
With George Takei.
Yes.
It was Phase 2 Star Trek, a head nods to the attempted Phase 2 Star Trek before Star Trek the Motion Picture. But you are involved with so much. You have
Yes,
won awards, but you also are humble and real. And I
yes.
appreciate you taking the time to be here tonight. But I do want to ask you this. Which hat do you like wearing the most? The writer, the producer, the director? Which is the one that Mark loves to put on?
Yes, well, at the core of my soul, I'm a writer, and everything else stems from that. My art form is television, so I have to be responsible for the entire product. So that's why I direct, that's why I produce. I have a full-time editor. We edit. That's the last draft of the show, basically, of the script. We just finished that a few days ago. It's like I take responsibility for all of it, and I like having control over all of it. Elaine and I write it, direct it, produce it. We write it. We cast the actors we want to work with, and in fact, George Takei, I was just emailing him and Brad a few days ago because there's a role I have for him in mind for him for Sweet Haven, which is the show I'm creating with Farscape's Rockne O'Bannon, and so it just continues, and then we're launching a Kickstarter campaign in the next few days to finance the next few hours of Space Command. So it just keeps going, and I sell investment shares to people who want to own part of the show and reap the benefits of that. It keeps going.
So we do have a surprise drop-in note here for you. The Shuttlepod Show reaches out and says hello. I love the Shuttlepod Show. I'm an
Yeah,
avid watcher,
that's great.
subscriber.
Yeah.
Great to see the world come together right there for you, my friend.
Yes, 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 yes. Well, it's wonderful because science fiction is a big tent and it allows a lot of different kinds of people in. And I think that's terrific. I have my own, I'm a liberal and so forth, but if someone's a conservative and they come with a good heart, we don't have to have an argument. We don't have to, we can make something happen. We can build something productive. When you mentioned that I have humility, I recently wrote a book called Greenlighting Yourself about how to do all the stuff I've been doing. And
Yeah.
I said, in order to succeed, you need a combination of humility and confidence. Humility is what allows you to learn. Confidence is what gets you where you need to go.
And I
So,
cannot rank that book high enough.
thanks.
Again, genius. I do want to drive everyone to your website. Mr. Sci-Fi is here with us tonight. People are chiming in, they're just flooding in, but they love the behind the scenes stories. I love your history of science fiction. Tell us about your channel. It's packed full of
Yeah.
stuff.
Well, I was having lunch with Glenn Mazzaro, who was the showrunner on Walking Dead, and he said a few years ago, and he said, you know so much about science fiction, you should have your own YouTube channel. And I thought, well, sure, okay. So I started the Mr. Sci-Fi channel because between what the people I've known and the shows I've written for and the books I've read and the movies I've seen, I mean, I am the world of science fiction. And so I thought, and there's so many stories I know that no one else knows because like Ray Bradbury told me this, or, Ted Sturgeon told me this, it's like, and I wanted to share all of it. So I just did Mr. Sci-Fi. And then when I have a big project, by the way, the Sulu episode you were mentioning is also on Mr. Sci-Fi. You can watch it there as well
Yes.
with my introduction. So I just wanted to share sort of my world of science fiction with my friends and everyone around the world. And we're 1,900 subscribers away from 100,000. So sign up, subscribe, spread the word, and we've had millions of hits. Space Command, the 2-hour pilot's been seen by over 3 million people on Mr. Sci-Fi, and it's gotten a 97% thumbs up. So those are numbers that networks would die for.
You want to hit the QR code, you want to subscribe, and you want to connect, give them a like, a share, a follow, all that good stuff there. I do want to wrap up with this. We are thrilled, beyond thrilled, that we had planned this show. And today we get to celebrate with Mark and all the other writers that the Hollywood writer's
Yeah,
strike is over. You get to
yes.
return to work after 5 months. Since I have you here, what does that mean to you? That the debates, the all the picketing, all the stuff, and now you get to move forward again.
Well, the funny thing is, you said I got to stop work. I did not stop working. It's funny because we are an independent company. We're not a studio or a network, so we have a waiver from SAG. We can continue shooting ongoingly, and so we were editing hours 5 and 6 of the show. We've been very active, and the only thing we couldn't do was pitch the show or pitch a script or something like that. We couldn't interact with the studios and the networks, but we could continue making the show. And so that's and also before we went to Comic-Con or the Star Trek convention in Vegas, our actors came with us and we cleared it through SAG that they could come, they could speak about the show, because again, we do not want to ever get we're SAG signatory. I'm in the Writers Guild, but for my brothers in the guild, my brothers and sisters in the guild, I'm thrilled that we're going back to work. And but the more that they embrace the model of what I'm doing, the better. They will find it incredibly liberating. And but anything that gets the good work out to the audience is worth the time and trouble.
Well, you are the perfect fit for How the Rock Stage Show. The birth of this is because I know the creative side is growing to independence. The studios are growing, the streaming content is growing. We have a new wealth of opportunities as independent creators that get to do what you've done all your career. We now get to do it, and this is our stage. So I really appreciate you taking the time, Marc, being with us here again. You want to connect with Marc, and Marc Zicree, again, award-winning producer, writer, director, animated TV. He's done it all, and he's not done.
Yes.
Marc, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it, Rich. It was terrific.
Marc Zicree again and again. We're always looking for more guests on How the Rock the Stage. We are reaching deeper into Hollywood. William Bodell was streaming along here tonight. William's been on the show. David Wood has been on the show. And we are loving to hear the backstories, the history, but also not just about the films and the show like we heard tonight. Who is Marc? How did Marc get the origin? What drove him to write? The backstory of the artist, the writer, the actor, the director is also part of what we love to hear on How the Rock the Stage. We do want to thank Audavita Studios for helping to produce this, and they're going to turn this episode to an audio episode. It'll be streaming with How the Rock the Stage on Apple Podcasts and other outlets. This will also be on YouTube and other channels to go connect and be a part of. We do want to say thank you for our amazing audience, for your questions, your participation here tonight. And again, we're going to be back here 7 o'clock Eastern Time next week, 7 p.m. Eastern Time for another live stream edition of How the Rock the Stage Show. Until then, I'm the Trigger, Rich Bontrager. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Rock the Stage.